Pre-vernum, time of stillness, year 3. It rose over his head into the sky, perhaps the better part of 2 exceptionally tall people, or 1 exceptionally tall demon beast. The flesh of the tree was a burnt, almost pitch black, and it was covered in pockmarks that looked as if they had come from unusually sharp claws. Mr. Mammon stared up at the tall, wavering branches ahead, heavy with what looked like perfectly safe, edible, and even delectable water fruit. No risk, no gain. He wasn't exactly a trained combatant, and his muscles wouldn't exactly have been described as bulging. The tree didn't budge, but Mammon did feel slightly sore, so there was that.
This really isn't gonna work out for me, is it?
His goatee felt a little chalkier than normal, and he was a little glad Krim wasn't around to see it. He hadn't seen the harpy since he had ran away, and thinking about that made him feel awful, though he was uncertain of what was the most awful about it, betraying Leopold, who was still the boss, even if he was Leo. Not trying to go back and find Krim, then trying and failing because as the weather had changed it was as if the island itself had changed, roiling and twisting beneath his sore and tired feet. Sighing, Mammon gave the tree a good kick. For a few moments he allowed himself to wistfully imagine his cart, lost in the confusion but beside the tree and overflowing with tasty water fruit. If it was water fruit, but red on yellow was a friendly fellow, right?
This is hopeless. It's not like I'm starving or anything.
Mammon murmured to himself, glaring at the tree and hoping against hope that someone might respond. So he was more than a little surprised when someone did.
You wouldn't want to eat that stuff, anyway. Why, it might give you dysentery. Or not, I'm not up to date on my herbology lore.
When Mr. Mammon had managed to pull himself out of the itchy, crawling ivy that seemed to permeate the inland lake he had camped out by, he could make out a humanoid figure, hunched over the unmoving waters with an equally placid smile upon his face. One of those worthless pretty boy types. Mammon decided, tapping his nose knowingly. Whether this guy was a human or not, though, he sure had been stealthy, which was reassuring, in a way. If he had meant to stir up some trouble, he could have done that, right? So naturally, that meant he was friendly, or at least, not immediately hostile.
Hey-oh, pal. Not so sure about that. In fact, I'd bet you a copper coin that I don't have its tasty water fruit. Red and gold are kind of my lucky colors, you might say, and I'm a gambling man.
The weirdo turned one blue iris his way, and shook his head, laughing with a wide smile.
Gambling? You'll have to count me out. I've won too many bets, recently. Luck is a fickle thing, after all. I'd hate to use all mine up. Are you hungry?
Despite the fact that his attention had gone back to the water in front of him, the man-waif didn't seem like the sort of guy that ended up hastening the end of someone's man life, and Mammon was beginning to feel increasingly unthreatened by him. He had a pleasant cadence to his tone, almost.
Well, if you've got something you wouldn't mind parting with. I've been eating prairie grass recently, can't say I'd recommend it.
Chuckling, Mammon took a seat at the smooth, slate rocks at his new companion's side, and held out a hand.
Mr. Mammon, at your temporary service and gratitude. I'd offer you a killer deal for food right now, but, I'm on harder times than I'd like to admit. HRRRRRMN, Mammon. Sounds like a familiar name. I feel like we've met before, somewhere.
Clapping his hands together, the young man laughed, and then took Mammon's hand and shook it warmly.
Recently, kind strangers have taken it on themselves to think up amusing nicknames for me, but between you and I, you can call me Zemiel. A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mr. Mammon.
Okay, that was weird. Mr. Mammon was certain that there had been nothing on the rock surface between them besides lake barnacles and watery algae, but there were several sandwiches of questionable origins there, now. And some sort of bottled carbonated lavender-accented water. So things go. Still, the water was just cool enough to be refreshing, and the sandwiches were oddly crisp and filling despite the fact they didn't taste like much of anything. Even the bread seemed faint and immaterial, more airy than biting into a tub of shortening.
So, Zemiel. What are you doing out here in a lake all by your lonesome? If you're prospecting, you should probably give up, unless you've got access to a spectacularly good drill.
Mammon wiped crumbs off of his face, and paused, stopping to take Zemil in. Specifically. Now that he was fairly close to the guy, Zemil was looking into the water with an intensity that was kind of frightening. There wasn't any emotion on his face, perhaps barring focus. It looked almost like he was going to just dive into the water himself, but in a fancy outfit like that. Nah, that'd be crazy. Just crazy. His response, however, was almost as crazy.
Fishing.
A slight smile crept onto Zemil's lips, and he lay back onto the rock, one leg against the other.
Not too successfully, I might add. Not that I'm an especially good fisherman, but don't you usually have to have a rod, or a net, or maybe a spear of some kind to go fishing? And anyway, that crazy strong dragon's been here, recently. That's why everything's so.
Mammon gestured about, crumbs falling from his black goatee. Around the grey-blue water, icy and empty, the once colorful beach rock had been turned glassy and obsidian in hue by the insane power of Dragunov, what had survived smelling of ozone and tin.
I guess I'm not a really good fisherman either.
Zemil confided, though he still seemed focused on the water below.
Do you mind if I ask you a question? You can feel free to decline, if you would like.
Mr. Mammon reached for another sandwich, not having realized just how hungry he had been. It wasn't as if the food that Zemil offered even felt filling, sure, but the sensation of eating and talking and in general just feeling sentient and alive.
Sure, shoot. I'm not famed for my good advice, either, but, if I can help a new friend out, well, the best deals always start with friendship, way I see it.
Zemil's smile melted, just a little. His eyes returned from where they'd been watching Mammon curiously, towards whatever captivated him so much about the water nearby, though Mammon began to have the wriggling idea of a doubt germinating in the dark corners of his mind. Perhaps it isn't the lake he's so entranced by.
Let's say I see a fish. It'd be no trouble to catch this fish. I could feed it a lure to fatten it up, or build a silver net and throw it upon the rocks, or spear it with my hands and eat it raw. Not that I'd do that, of course.
He chuckled, and Mammon chuckled politely in return, even though he had begun to look around for convenient paths that looked as if they lead somewhere, anywhere but of course. Any and all roads that had led to what had once been this inland oasis were now smoldering, the air toxic with invisible particles.
But it isn't the fish I want, exactly. No, that's not right. The fish amuses me a little, and because of that I want it to have a happier life than the other fish around it. What would you do?
Mammon stared up at the sky. It was very blue. Painfully, oppressively blue, cloudless and silent and roaring with a distant sound that was no longer thunder nor wind. Just an empty, breathless noise that was discordant, violent, and beautiful.
Bit too much for a merchant like myself. I'd probably just eat the fish with some garlic butter sauce.
Zemil tittered a little and tried to stifle his laughter, but did a poor job of it, his eyes closing as he turned away.
Sorry, ahaha. I guess I did ask a strange question, didn't I? Ftahahaha. Well, other than that.
Mammon sighed, and stared into the water. His reflection stared back at him, pensive and unpleasant. He didn't like seeing it so close, but the water itself seemed off. Not merely the strange, unreal, and almost opalescent fading cyan of it all but... With a hesitant flick of his hand, Mammon stirred the water. In its ripples, he could see things far below. No plants nor insects, nor even fish. Only bones, bleached and empty of whatever flesh had once clung to them. And perhaps more importantly, he seemed to be quite alone. Jolting to his feet, Mr. Mammon looked aside, sighing in slight relief that Zemil was still present, if a bit close and with an extremely amused expression on his face. The kind that spelled trouble, the sort of trouble that Mammon felt he had experienced quite enough of.
So, did you figure it out yet?
Mammon stared back, letting his half-hearted shrug reply for him.
Nope. I've got nothing. If there was some deeper meaning to it, you'll have to ask someone else. Though, what the heck? I'd advise you to go fishing less often. Spend a year selling stuff to people. It'll give you a new perspective on life.
Whatever Zemiel had been thinking, he seemed to have come to his own conclusion, rising to his feet with a yawning stretch.
It's certainly been fun, Mr. Mammon. Let's meet again sometime, or not. I'll consider what you said, but for now.
And then, whatever Zemiel had been about to say was drowned out by very angry curses and constant squawking. Mammon was surprised, and overjoyed, of course. But mostly surprised as Crimsolino lurched from the sky in a flurry of vermilion. For a fraction of a second, an indescribable look came over Zemiel's face. Then, he smiled. And nothing happened. Tilting his head to his side with confusion, Zemiel whistled impressively.
Well, that doesn't usually happen. How peculiar. And how unfortunate. Away with you, you pescatarian plebeian. First you go offering Mammon sandwiches without noticing me in the clouds above, nor offering me a sample.
Huffing fire into the pleasantly crisp air, Crimsolino's talons sunk into the stony ground and left tiny indentations in the space-black rock.
Furthermore, I'm of half a mind to simply eviscerate you for the crime of being far too. It'd be easier to gesticulate with hands, Crim. I'd be glad to help you though, if you would like a stand-in. Thank you, dear Mammon. It would be much obliged.
Unruffling her neck as Zemiel watched the two of them with unconcealed amusement, Crimsolino gave a tiny humph and went over the insults and concerns she had held in her mind as she swooped down like a fury of fire and vengeance. Somehow, however, they seemed petty, for once. The thought was strange to her, but it mattered not. Holding out one wing in front of her, Crimsolino gave a short HMPH and waved it twice. Mammon duplicated the gesture at her side, grinned toothy and fine with the foolishness of it all.
Well, it isn't important. I forgive you, for now, but you'll give me your cloak, as it's very pretty. No.
Zemiel replied bluntly, pulling the cloak around himself and waggling his eyebrows as he laughed. Crimsolino balked and balked simultaneously, but it had no effect. Whatever had surprised him earlier, it seemed he did not feel intimidated by her. Frustrating.
But, you're an awfully good sport, and I'd be lucky to have someone looking after me like that. So, I'll tell you two something nice. Do you know of Lazarus?
Something felt strange. Deeply unpleasant. Like the itching you get on the back of your hand right before you realize a fly, or a leech, or stinging nettle has left one of those odd welts that won't go away and seems to fester more the longer you look at it. Mr. Mammon tried to center himself and look composed. Crimsolino, however, simply glowered, her eyes no longer leaving the jovial blue-shaded mirror of Zemiel's.
He's awake, sometimes, though trapped. If nothing actually reaches him, he'll be content to stay far beneath the earth. Not realizing old Dragunov is right above him. Well, that's me, then. I'll see you two around, possibly. Thanks for the sage advice, Mr. Mammon. I'll be considering it.
For a minute, and only a minute, Mr. Mammon thought that Zemiel might disappear in the manner of wizards, but instead, cloak still pulled around him beforehand. He simply spread his arms wide and ran off, laughing to himself.
I do not care for him.
Crimsolino murmured sulphurously, snorting smoke and curling her head to the ground, trying to find a patch of it that did not look as unclean as she was doomed to deal with, nor feel as uncomfortable as it looked untowards. She may have perked up a little at Mammon's light hug, or might have simply lidded her eyes and rolled them, for the Duchess was tired, and it was quite hard to say. All the same.
Glad to see you, too, Crim. Can't say he was the usual type of guy I encounter around weird abandoned inland non-desert oases, but that's a pretty slim category. How have you been, all right?
Mr. Mammon sat down and stared back into the water, still filled with bones, though in a way they were not disturbing. The place felt peaceful, and clearly the dead in the water had been there for some time. Crimsolino rolled against the rock, still trying to approximate something akin to comfort, and failing. It was a hard, unpleasant surface, and civilization was well and truly dead, here. More than the physical discomfort of it all, however. Her eyes dimmed, downcast and opalescent reds reflecting in the pool beside them.
You know, Mammon, I honestly didn't want to return. I thought, you must be awfully coarse with me. For I quite planned to stay with him. A duchess does not break her vow. It is the way of things. Crim. I wouldn't care about something. No, I know that well. But... ah, you see.
Stirring the water with one of her wings, Crimsolino blew fire against the lapping surface of the lake, and the two watched as steam and smoke danced across the surface, creating a tiny illusion of images that seemed to flicker and dance in front of them.
I've been following you from above, for some time. I just didn't know what to say, nor do. And you seemed to be doing fine, so I did not want to prove a burden, or make things mentally difficult for you, or...
Laying back against the black stone, Mammon half smiled, half sighed.
No harm in saying you cared, Crim. I didn't notice you there. You must be even pretty far up. But if I were able to fly around, I'd probably have done the same. And I mean... you still think about trying to find him, as well.
Both were silent until Mammon threw a rock into the water. It made a tiny sound that he privately decided was aplorp and sank into the water, much to his satisfaction.
To be honest. Yeah. Doesn't feel right leaving an old man to himself, even if it's Leo. And I don't have the weird, antiquated sense of morals you two do, but, you know, that doesn't mean I'm immoral. I'm immoral 'cause I'm a demon.
Both nodded. This made perfect sense, after all.
Well, that's something of a relief, though I have no clue as to how to find him. And if what that unpleasantly well-groomed... was that what set you off? Was that what you didn't like? Quiet, Mammon. I'm still moderately sour about most every indignity we have had to shoulder, as of late. I could decide that you are one of those indignities, I most certainly could.
The harpy's timbre took on a mellifluous tone that didn't quite match the huskiness of her voice, but was nice all the same, even if the odds were 10 to 1 he was being made fun of.
Do as you like. I've eaten, so I could care less. Hey. Actually, that's weird. It doesn't feel like I've had anything at all. Do you think you could reach those water fruits up there, Crim? Maybe knock a few down for us.
Crimsolino shot a glance to the soul-standing tree, maw shut in a bad attempt at tamping down upon the edges of her teeth, hinting at mocking amusement.
Dearest Mammon. Uh-oh. You do realize those are patterned in rose and gold, do you not? You would die of thirst while drinking the liquid from them.
Massaging his beard until it stood out like a thunderbolt, Mammon grumbled. Far too lazy to do much more, excepting the occasional glower which he hoped communicated the seriousness of how wrong she was.
Nope. Because, see, they're gold and red, and you're gold and red. And you're only mildly toxic, so I figured, hey. I can probably walk it off.
Crimsolino was silent, smiling to herself in the peculiar avian way that only she could. There were times, however rare, when the demon wondered what her actual smile had looked like. Not that it mattered. Crim was Crim, after all.
I'm unsure of whether or not to be grateful, or to find that rather vile. I am far more than merely mildly toxic after all. There are words that have been invented solely to describe the potency of my poisons, and if not, there certainly should be. Well, we'll work on that on the road. And unfortunately, we'll be hoofing it, but... no big deal, right?
He scrabbled to his feet, looking at his reflection in the waters beneath them. And though they were long dead, and though it was a strange thought to have, he felt that maybe, the forlorn skeletons beneath looked a little less forlorn, and a little less lonely.
No. No big deal. Humph. With you on the ground and I ruling the skies, we'll find that useless old man before he gets himself into too much trouble, and perhaps give him a stern talking to.
Crimsolino rose slowly from the ground, trailing feathers and bellowing fire into the cloudless sky above. It felt like familiar and right, and Mammon was quick to go to the roads, invisible and broken by the rampages of Dragunov as they were, before Crimsolino's wing, forceful yet gentle, grazed his shoulder.
Mammon, one thing, and I'm afraid I must be strict. Hit me with it, so long as it's not more lies about those obviously delicious water fruit, I can take it.
Crimsolino's smile faded a bit, the gilded expanse of her face hardening.
We absolutely must not go on anything that resembled a road. You can't see it, but anything that does, dies not long after.
Mammon shuddered. Right, of course. He had seen the weird forms, fallen over and lumpen, some still heaving with the open sores and strange, bloodshot eyes. He had known. And he had almost gallivanted right onto the open road, or rather where the roads had once been. Such as they were.
Thanks, Crim. Well, just keep an eye on me, all right?
And the Duchess smiled, and roared into the sky. Chapter end.